right, so we've been building a list, right? You see it there in your handout. Ways in which Boaz foreshadows Jesus. In this book, Boaz is called a mighty man. Some translations, a worthy man. And we've been noting that Boaz points to the ultimate mighty man, Jesus, in many ways. And we've seen 7 of those. He was a relative. He showed favor. He was devout, respectful. He protected, provided, satisfied. And just very briefly as we begin this morning, I want to add number 8. He gave rest. Because that's what we just read in chapter 3, verse 1, right? My daughter, should I not seek rest for you? That's that word about safety and stability and security that we saw back in chapter 1. And Boaz's protection, number 5, and his provision, number 6, resulted in rest, number 8, for Naomi and for Ruth. And while we're not, obviously that could be a whole sermon itself, but we just want to note that again, it points us right to Jesus, who calls to those who have no rest, and he says, come to me, you who are weary, and you who are heavy laden, I will give you rest. It's his protection, and it's his provision that we have in him that allow us to say that it's well with our souls, whether life circumstances are peaceful like a river or sorrows like sea billows roll. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, it's well with my soul. You can only say that in Jesus. And so there is a rest in the ultimate mighty man, Jesus, and the world will keep promising it to you other places, and it won't be able to deliver. And so you may need to say today, Jesus, my heart is weary and my heart is heavy laden. Please help me. I have no rest, and I need to find it in you. But we've got to keep going in chapter 3 because this is a complicated chapter to teach, a complicated section to study. And so I don't want to feel rushed this morning and realize that we haven't studied Ruth yet, though we're 5 sermons into our study of Ruth. That's the next sermon, which is 3 Sundays from now, Lord willing. So we're not going to talk about the Ruth part of Ruth chapter 3 until later. We're going to talk about the Boaz part. Number 9, Boaz foreshadows Jesus, the ultimate mighty man, because he redeemed. He redeemed. Remember, Ruth had gone out into the fields, hoping to find someone who might let her glean. And in God's kindness, she came to the fields of Boaz, who protected her and provided for her in abundant ways. And when she came home, loaded with grain, and with her to-go box with the leftovers from her feast that Boaz had provided, her very startled mother-in-law wanted to know, where have you been? Whose fields have you been gleaning in? And so if we look at chapter 2, verse 19, the end of verse 19, Ruth told her, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And the end of chapter 2, verse 20, Naomi said, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So there's the word. And then chapter 2 ends with Ruth spending the harvest season gleaning in Boaz's fields. So you know that Boaz is a family redeemer, but then there's time that passes here and it seems like nothing is happening. 6 weeks or so go by until the end of harvest, and there's no further indication that redemption was coming. So at the end of the harvest, Ruth went to Boaz with a request. Let's read it. Ruth 1, verse 2. Is not Boaz our relative? Ruth 3, verse 2. Ruth 3, verse 2. Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. They are celebrating the end of harvest. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." Okay, we'll come back later to this when we study Ruth. But for now, just see that in chapter 3, verse 9, her request was that he spread his wings over her because he was a redeemer. Simply put, that means, please marry me so that you can be the redeemer for Naomi's family. She was asking him to marry her, to be the redeemer for Naomi's family. And Boaz went on, as we just read, to tell her that there was one other closer relative in town who had the first opportunity, or responsibility is a better word, we'll see later, to redeem them. And if not, Boaz would. So chapter 4 records what Boaz did next. So look with me at chapter 4, verse 1. Now, Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." And then in verse 14, the women say to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer." All right, so let's try to unpack some of that. You can see it's a lot. What is the meaning of a redeemer? Why is this so important? Why was marrying Ruth part of the deal? There are a lot of things we don't know, but there are two parts of the Jewish law that help us: Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25. First of all, we have to understand who owned the land of Israel. Not a trick question. Who owned the land of Israel? God. This is in Leviticus 25. Here's what he says. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. That's what God said. The Jewish people were like managers of God's land. Next phrase in that verse, you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Did you know that? That the Israelites were strangers in their own land? They didn't own it. God did. And because it was God's land, they didn't have the right to just sell it to anybody they wanted. How would you feel if you gave a precious family heirloom to one of your grandchildren in the hopes that they might pass it along to their grandchildren, and found out that the next day they went to the local antique store and sold it. In a slightly similar way, Israel's land was God's. And so they couldn't just read the market and say, hey, we could get a real good price for this thing right now. Let's see what Assyrian or what Egyptian or what Roman might want to buy this from us. They could not do that. It was God's land. Now, not only was it God's land, but they were also God's people. And you're familiar, I'm sure, with the 12 tribes of Israel and these families and the parts of the land that were divided up for those families. Who did that? Who divided the land up? God did. In other words, God said to these families of Israel, you take care of this part of my land, and now you guys take care of this part of my land, and you take care of this part of my land. He assigned the families to different parts of the land. And because of those things, when you think about buying and selling land in Israel, you have to realize it's completely different from what you know about land and houses in America today. It worked nothing like this. There were specific rules to keep the land in the family of Abraham and in the specific families and regions which God had given to each one. But now think about how complicated sin and death would make that. If nobody ever died and if sin never messed up relationships, that would all work great. But as soon as you introduce sin and death, what happens when somebody like Naomi's husband leaves the land during a famine? Well, what's going on with his land? What happens when somebody like Naomi's husband dies? When his sons marry Moabite women? When his sons die? When there are no grandchildren? Now what about their family's responsibility in God's land after all of that? You can see how this would get really messy. And so that's why many years before this, God had given some direction about those complications. And this is where Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25 connect to Ruth's story. So first of all, Leviticus 25 said, God said in Leviticus 25 that if a Jewish man became poor and sold part of his property, then a family member could come and buy it back into the family. And that family member was called a redeemer, right? A redeemer was a relative who could afford to buy back what a family member had sold. Okay, so picture someone selling a family heirloom at the antique store to make a little bit of money, and somebody else in the family hears about it and books it down to the antique store to try to buy it back. Now, they're going to have to pay full market price now, right? But it's worth it to get that back in the family. You could say that family member redeemed that heirloom. So you see on your handout, the redeemer had to be, in Israel, the redeemer had to be a relative who was able to pay the price and willing to do so. There's a little bit of a complicated nuance here, but it connects directly to what happens in Ruth chapter 4. While God gave these instructions, it was not a requirement. There was some shame, which is why Boaz put that other redeemer on the spot publicly. There was some shame if you didn't do it, but there wasn't a rule that you had to go buy it back. And so the person had to be a relative who was able to pay the price and willing to do it. Now, Leviticus 25 also uses the phrase nearest redeemer. So that's why there was this idea of an order of responsibility in redemption. So you see that in the book of Ruth. So there are lots of connections between Leviticus 25 and our story. Naomi was apparently having to sell the family's land. So her family's inheritance in Israel was about to be lost. Boaz was a family member. He was the second closest redeemer, and the closest chose not to do it. He was able to redeem. He apparently had the money needed. He was willing to redeem. He wanted to care for Naomi's family in this way. You see how those pieces kind of all connect together? The story of Ruth fits well with what the law said. And in those things, Boaz foreshadows Jesus. And this isn't really my point right now. We'll come back to it later. But we already talked about how Jesus is a relative, right? Because he took on flesh. not ashamed to call us brothers, became humanity while fully God to qualify as our Redeemer. Was Jesus able? Boy, was he able. And nobody else was able. Fully God, fully man, lived a fully righteous life so that only his death could pay the price to redeem sinners. Qualified, able. Was he willing? He said, I laid down my life on my own initiative. No one takes it away from me. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So Jesus is our qualified, willing, and able Redeemer. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, we've learned about how Boaz could redeem the land and property of Naomi's family. But what did marriage to Ruth have to do with this? So if the land was God's land, and if he had placed particular families in particular regions to take care of it, then it wasn't okay for those families to just disappear. For those family lines to end and those families not exist anymore. And that is what was just about to happen to Naomi's family. Now, certainly there were many families in Israel that did just end, right? Through death and sin. In hindsight, we can see that it was extremely important that this particular family not disappear, right? They didn't know that in the moment. We know that now. But in general, it was true that the families of Israel needed to continue because God had appointed them as stewards for his land. So that then connects to Deuteronomy 25. We were just talking about Leviticus 25. Deuteronomy 25 gives directions about how families can continue even when there are unexpected deaths. And basically it says if a man died without a son, one of his brothers could marry his widow. And if they had a son, that son would be the legal heir of his mother's first husband. You got that? If a man died without a son, one of his brothers could marry his widow. And if they had a son, that son would be a legal heir of the man who died. I don't know how to answer all of your questions about that, so I'm not going to ask you what they are. But the overall point is that God was making provision for these families to not dead end, but to continue. So, if Ruth didn't marry a qualified redeemer in her husband's family, then the family had no future. Ruth could marry someone else and have a future herself. But to take care of Naomi and that family, she had to marry somebody in Naomi's family. That explains chapter 3, verse 10. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. Boaz is not saying, oh, how sweet of you that you're willing to marry an old guy. He's saying, this is your kindness to Naomi and her family, that rather than going and marrying somebody you would be more likely to marry, which would not help her family, you are instead willing to marry me to continue the family line of your deceased husband. See, if she married a younger man, no matter how rich he was, you see what Boaz said there? Didn't matter how much money he was, he didn't count. He didn't qualify because he wasn't a family redeemer. Deuteronomy 25 also helps us understand some things in chapter 4, like the fact that Boaz was supposed to give the closest redeemer a chance first. And as I mentioned earlier, it also helps us understand why the closest redeemer could say, no, thank you. Because in Deuteronomy 25, it was optional. Again, there was shame attached to it if you didn't, but it wasn't required. So all those pieces connect. And then this also probably explains why chapter 4, verse 6, the first redeemer couldn't do it. I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So he knew that if he and Ruth had a son, it would make things way too complicated for the future of his family. Now, I don't know all the reasons for that, but it definitely connects to that, Deuteronomy 25. So I don't think we should blame that guy. I don't think he did anything wrong in this situation. So I know this is complicated, but the bottom line is that Boaz married Ruth to continue the family line of Naomi's husband and Ruth's husband. Little did Boaz know how important that one family line was. There were surely all these families that had lost their land or been cut off. What did it matter to redeem this one little family? And so I love the principle illustrated there, that Boaz did what was right even though he didn't know all that God was doing. He probably thought he was only making a small difference for one small family. Yet his little obedience changed your life, changed your eternity. He didn't know that. And sometimes when we're trying to decide whether to obey, it's easy to say, why does it matter? How's it going to make any difference? But one of the characteristics of a truly mighty man, a Christ-like man, is that he trusts that God is doing more than he can see in the moment. And so he trusts that obedience always matters. God will always use our obedience even when we don't have any idea how. And what Satan loves to do is narrow your vision down to only see the current moment. And in the current moment, it doesn't seem like the obedience really matters. And it doesn't seem like the disobedience is going to really matter either. You know, whatever. No, it's not whatever. It matters. And a story like Boaz reminds us that obedience and disobedience always mean much more than we can see in the moment. Part of the law of part of the law of sowing and reaping is that seeping and rowing. That's a different law. Not in the Bible. Part of the law of sowing and reaping is that you reap. Okay, what's the word that goes in the blank? You reap blank than you sow. You reap blank than you sow. I don't know if you reap more. You reap later than you sow, right? You reap later. And so that's why Satan wants to take your vision and narrow it down to the moment, because in the moment, it doesn't look like disobedience matters, and it doesn't look like obedience matters, because you reap later than you sow in both cases. And so part of godly Christ-like character is trusting God can see more. There's a bigger picture. I'm going to obey and do the right thing even when it doesn't look like it matters. Now, I know this raises another question, and that is, did Boaz actually do the right thing by marrying a Moabite? So I'm going to give you my opinion about that, and it's just my opinion, okay? If it was wrong for Ruth's first husband to marry her, how was it right for Boaz to marry her? Here's how I would answer that. Sin makes things very complicated, and this seems especially true of sins related to sexual relationships, marriage covenants, and the conception and raising of children. Those things have a depth of meaning and continuance of meaning that mean when you get sin mixed in with those things, it gets very complicated. So I don't want to confuse us this morning. I'm not trying to talk through these examples, but I want to make sure you know what I mean. Like, if a teen girl gets pregnant to someone she's not married to, should she marry him? I'm not asking you to answer that. There will be disagreement about that. That'll depend on the situation. But can you see how it might seem like either choice is a bad choice in that scenario? I'm not saying there's not a best choice for her to make. But when you look at it, you may say, marry? No, bad idea. Don't marry? Bad idea. Like Bible principles both ways. Or if a man has children by multiple women. Well, now, how does he parent children that he's had by multiple women? That is very, very complicated. You head one direction at the neglect of another direction. It feels like a lose-lose. You see what I'm saying? Sin always makes things complicated, and sin related to sexual relationships, marriage covenants, and the conception and raising of children seem especially complicated. And I know that I'm touching on very sensitive things, and I'm not trying to bring up things that are hurtful this morning. My point is that Boaz was in one of those situations, and whose sin was it that put him in that situation? It was not his. That's the key point. It was Naomi's husband's sin, and it was Ruth's husband's sin, deciding to leave the land, deciding to marry Moabites. They were the ones who sinned and made the mess. And so Boaz then ends up in a situation in which, okay, so think about this. If he didn't redeem Naomi, Naomi's family, and if he didn't marry Ruth, then he's neglecting those parts of the law that said you should redeem. He's the last available redeemer. There is no one after him. And so if he says no to redemption, he's neglecting what God said about the lands and the families. If he does redeem and marry Ruth, he's neglecting the laws about the holiness and distinctiveness of God's people that say you shouldn't marry a Moabite. So what does he do? It is a lose-lose because sin made a mess. And so I would suggest that in the situation he was in, first of all, he was not guilty. It was not his sin. And second of all, it was best for him to marry Ruth and redeem his family. He was forced into a difficult choice by the sin of others, and I think he made the best choice and God honored it. Now, what's the principle we should learn from that? I think it's, because the principle isn't, you should marry Moabites or something like that. The principle is you should hate sin, right? Sin has nasty, messy, ugly consequences that are often hidden until later, and they often bite other people just as much as you. And so it's a reminder to hate sin and to love obedience. And when you are in the moment thinking, look, my disobedience isn't going to matter, it's okay, you're being lied to. Obedience always matters, whether we can see it in the moment or not. All right, that's number 9, Boaz redeemed. Now, number 10, he sacrificed. And this is, of course, just part of redemption, but it connects with the sacrifice of Jesus so directly that it's worth considering it separately. Sacrificial love paid the price necessary for redemption. If you look in chapter 4, the discussion in chapter 4 is about money. It's about a price. Chapter 4, verse 3, Naomi is selling the land. Chapter 4, verse 4, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it. There was a sacrifice to be made. There was a price to be paid. Actually, 2 prices, the money to buy the field and the responsibility to marry Ruth and attempt to have a child that wouldn't legally be your own. And we've already seen, the first Redeemer was willing to pay the money but not willing to marry Ruth because of the consequences for his family. But Boaz could. So the general point here that we need to see is that a Redeemer wasn't just a kind-hearted person. A Redeemer was a person who could pay the price that was needed. The regulations about redemption allowed one family member to sacrifice for the good of another. And I am amazed to see again how the ancient story found in the Hebrew Scriptures at least 1,000 years before Jesus came point right to Jesus. How did that happen? So we're going to focus here as we finish this morning on how Boaz foreshadows Jesus in the sacrificial price. But I just want to briefly mention, without stealing our thunder for later, that Ruth too demonstrates sacrificial love in this book. If you look with me in chapter 3 again, when Boaz woke up and discovered this woman at his feet, remember what happened here? Verse 9, chapter 3, verse 9, he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he then says he knows that she could have gone and married other men, but instead has chosen to marry him for the sake of the family is the reason. So she was saying to him, marry me so that you can be the redeemer for the family of my deceased husband and mother-in-law. Anybody could have been redeemer for her in terms of giving her rest. So what does Boaz call it in verse 10? He says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first." Okay, that word kindness is very important. It is chesed again. It is loyal, generous love. It is sacrificial love. Boaz knows that that's her motive. Sacrificial love for her family is the reason why she asks Boaz to marry her. All right, so we'll come back to Ruth a lot more later, but I just wanted to note that she shows the same redemptive sacrificial love. Now, okay, so that's her motive for the marriage. What was Boaz's motive? Well, it's the same thing. It's there in chapter 4, verse 5. Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Same motive. He married her to preserve the land, to keep it in the family, to preserve a future for Naomi, to preserve the legacy of this family and their heritage in Israel. Now, in the process, he provided rest for Ruth, and he got a wife for himself. But that was not his or her first motivation. This is a marriage founded upon sacrificial love for others. We often talk about how a marriage should be founded upon sacrificial love for one another. That's totally true. The catch with that is what I talked about just a Sunday or two ago, that when you're dating or whatever you would like to call it, it's very easy to put on sacrificial love for one another. It's very easy for a time to give lots of gifts and do lots of things that make you look like a very generous person, when that may not actually be your character. You're just trying to win a prize. And so actually, the key to a really godly marriage is two people who consistently demonstrate sacrificial love for other people. That's the proof of it. If they demonstrate consistent sacrificial love for other people, of course they'll do it for one another in the marriage, because it's the heart of Christ that they have for one another. And so I don't doubt that Ruth and Boaz loved one another, but that is scarcely mentioned in this book, if it's mentioned at all. What is very clear is their sacrificial love for Naomi and her family. And that is what is the right foundation for a relationship that's going to last. Built on sacrificial love, not just for one another, but for others. So a price had to be paid to redeem Naomi and her family, and both Ruth and Boaz demonstrated the sacrificial love that was necessary. And in this, they foreshadowed Jesus. So let's finish up now by just reminding ourselves about Jesus and his redemption of us. So turn to Matthew 20. If we use the antique illustration that I was using earlier, and we start to try to apply that directly to ourselves, we might say that you and I are the ones who sold the precious family heirloom. Didn't you? What did you sell? There are some ways we could say that. You sold your eternity. You sold your soul by your sin. It's as if you walked into the antique store and you said, okay, here's my soul. Here's my relationship with God. Here's my eternity. I'll sell it to you for the passing pleasures of sin. And then Jesus came and offered to buy back what we had sold. And what was the price? His own life. We sold life. And Jesus paid the price of death to get it back for us. Matthew 20, verse 25. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." What's a ransom? A ransom is the money that the family member gives the antique store owner to buy it back. It's the price paid for redemption. It's the money Boaz paid to buy the land and possessions of Naomi's husband. So the word ransom implies three important things. And what we're going to do now is we're going to switch illustrations, okay? I've been using the antique store illustration. We're going to switch now to the biblical illustration of prison or bondage. The first thing that the word ransom implies is bondage. That's what goes in your first blank there, bondage. The word ransom was used for prisoners of war, buying them back. It was used for slaves and other people who had to sell themselves to others. Naomi was about to sell the family's inheritance so that it would be, metaphorically, in bondage to someone else. And she would probably be a servant for someone else when she did that. The Bible says that Jesus came to redeem you from the bondage of your sin. Whoever commits sin is the slave of sin. And the Bible says that sin puts us into bondage to all sorts of things: corruption, defilement, futility, the domain of darkness, the mastery of Satan, a curse. You could picture all those things like chains that sin wraps around you. And God, in depicting those things for us, is trying to help us understand the consequences of our sin. God wants you to picture yourself in prison if you're going to understand the gospel. Do you think that's the way most people picture themselves? We live in a day of freedom, right? This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. You don't say to a non-Christian, you know, you're like enslaved, and they say, you're right. Hadn't thought about that. But God says you have to see yourself in a completely dark prison, disgusting and defiled, with a terrible prison guard. It's a prison where life has no value, where everyone is destined for nothing but death. It is death row. There is a guilty verdict against you, a sentence of death. Your sentence is written down and chained to you so that you can't get away from it. These are the ways the Bible describes our bondage to sin, and it wants you to picture yourself in that kind of imprisonment and filth on death row, and it tells you that you sold yourself into that bondage. You walked into the antique store and sold yourself to get the passing pleasures of sin. We went to the slave market and sold ourselves into the bondage. But Isaiah 61:1 says that Jesus came to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners. So the word ransom implies bondage. Secondly, it also implies a price that must be paid. Since this is the word for ransom, money. The money to buy back prisoners of war, the money to free a slave, the money you have to take to the antique store and pay the full price to get that thing back. Or to use the prison illustration, it's talking about the price of justice. If you're in prison with a just sentence of death, you can't just be set free. The sentence has to be carried out. In other words, it's not enough to just have a kind-hearted Redeemer show up. You got to have a rich Redeemer show up. You have to have a Redeemer who is able to pay the price. Sin has a price. The judge of the universe gives a verdict and a sentence, and justice has to be satisfied. And so if there's going to be redemption for your sin, there'll have to be a Redeemer who can pay sin's price. So the word ransom implies bondage. It implies a price that must be paid. And third, it implies the inability to pay that price. Is there a greater curse on our country today than people's sense that they're good? In terms of the progress of the gospel, is there a greater curse on our country today than people's sense that they're good? The word ransom implies your inability to pay the price. Now, admittedly, in the Old Testament, there were some situations in which someone could get enough money to buy back the land they'd sold or something. You will not get enough to pay sin's price. You will not. Jesus told parables that illustrated this, parables of impossibly large debts, astronomical amounts. You are stuck in the prison of your sin, and you cannot get yourself out. And no matter how many religions tell people that if they work hard enough, give enough money, do enough religious sacraments, turn over a new leaf and be a better person, no matter how many religions tell people that, those religions have never gotten anyone out of the prison of sin. And no matter how much people tell themselves that they're good, that won't get them out of the prison of sin. You are unable to pay the price. Stuck with a price you can't pay. And then, as Charles Wesley pictured it, light pours into the prison. Long my imprisoned spirit lay, he wrote, fast bound in sin and nature's night. Fast bound means bound tightly. And nature's night, I don't know exactly what he's referring to, but I suppose he's referring to our sin nature, born in sin, and the darkness and death that comes with. Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound by sin and nature's night. Thine eye diffused a quickening, a life-giving ray, a ray of light. I woke. The dungeon blazed, flamed with light. My chains fell off. My heart was free. I rose, went forth, and followed thee. Boaz was a little redeemer who foreshadowed Jesus, the great redeemer. Jesus came to you in your prison. He wasn't turned away by your bad attitude because you had one. He wasn't turned away by the stench, the corruption and defilement of your sin. He wasn't turned away by the ugliness. He wasn't turned away by the terrible master you had or the darkness of your situation. And he wasn't turned away by the size of your debt. It was written right there. The wages of your sin was death. And so there it was, what he would have to pay to redeem you. But he would not stop. Matthew 20:28, he came to give his life as a ransom for many. Titus 2:14, he gave himself for us to redeem us. Hebrews 9:12, his own blood obtained eternal redemption. 1 Peter 1:19, we were ransomed with the very costly blood of Christ, and he did it as a gift of his grace, not because you earned it or talked him into it or impressed him. When we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. He first loved us. It was all grace. Grace alone that looked into our prison, saw the certificate of our debt, and said, I'll pay that. And so we should surely glory in our Redeemer. I have to ask you, though, if he actually is your Redeemer, because the Bible makes it clear that it's possible to reject him, to disbelieve, to refuse to come forth and follow him. It's possible to say, no, I'm not such a bad person as that. I'm a good person compared to most. It's possible to say, I'm not in prison. I'm as free as anybody can be. I do whatever I want, which is exactly the problem, right? It's possible to say, well, I'm not perfect, but I'm a very religious person, and so I think God will be fine with me. It's possible to say, hey, I like the passing pleasures of sin, so I'll pass on Jesus. Thanks anyways. Have you admitted your sin, your debt, your bondage, your inability to pay the price? Have you believed that Jesus paid the price to buy back what you sold by your sin? Have you come in faith and repentance to Jesus? Is he your Redeemer? I want to tack on two very brief points about Boaz because they connect so beautifully to Jesus and complete the story. Why don't you turn back to Ruth so we can see it? One of the things that just amazes me about the book of Ruth is that it reads like a book that somebody who knew about Jesus wrote as like an allegory of the gospel. And yet it's right there in the Hebrew scriptures long before Jesus came along. What is that? The Bible's got one author. That's what it is. One author. So there are these little lines in Ruth that are just like gospel gems. And one of them, so first, point 11 on your list is that Boaz, he foreshadowed Jesus because he kept his promises. Chapter 3, verse 13, the end of chapter 3, verse 13, if the other Redeemer is not willing to redeem you, then as Yahweh lives, I will redeem you. Now he's stating that as a solemn oath, right? As Yahweh is alive, I will redeem you. But isn't there kind of a cool little irony in that word, in those words? I know not that Boaz meant it at all, but isn't it very true that as Yahweh is alive, you have a redeemer? Because he died and lived again, we are certainly redeemed. Our redemption is as certain as the resurrection of Jesus. Just as Boaz kept his promise to redeem Naomi and Ruth, so every promise of God is yes for us in Jesus. So Boaz kept his promises, and then number 12, he finished the work. And chapter 4 shows that and shows how it finishes legally. You know, you've got the whole sandal deal that goes on there in chapter 4. But it's chapter 3, verse 18. That's the wonderful little line. She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Naomi knew something about how men work, but that's also just a wonderful little arrow pointing us to Jesus. You see that determination in Jesus, who said to his disciples at the end of the Last Supper, "Rise, let us be going, the betrayer is at hand." And then he said, just a few hours later, so probably, she said, he will settle the matter today. And so I think of Jesus coming out of the garden early on the morning of the day when he would die, and he says to Peter, "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" He was going to settle the matter that day. A half-completed redemption is no redemption at all. You see what I mean? If you're in prison and you've got $1 billion debt and a wonderfully rich donor shows up with $900 million, how are you doing? You just got $100 million left. If somebody goes to the antique store and pays most of the price to get the family heirloom back, and there's no other redeemer, then what good did it do? This is what religions offer people with Jesus. They offer people a partially completed redemption. Now you do the rest. That is no redemption at all. Jesus completely finished the work. Hebrews 9:12, he entered once for all, into the holy places by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Jesus kept his promises and finished the work, and he will fully and perfectly apply that redemption to you. He will keep his promises to you, and he will finish the work that he has begun in you. So we've added these last 5 points to our list today. Boaz foreshadowed Jesus, the ultimate mighty man, because he gave rest, redeemed, sacrifice, kept his promises, and finished the work. All of that revolves around redemption and points so incredibly forward 1,100 or something years later to Jesus.